Cyril Ramaphosa, the President of South Africa, has been a vocal supporter of the topic of reparations for slave victims being discussed on a global scale. He underlined in his speech to the UN how important it is that this matter be on the UN agenda. The World Conference Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance was hosted in South Africa, and this call was made during the 20th anniversary memorial event of the Durban Declaration and Program of Action. The difficulties that descendants of Africans who were sold into slavery continue to suffer were brought to light by President Ramaphosa. A large number of these descendants still endure poverty, discrimination, and underdevelopment. He emphasized that South Africa is in favor of adopting particular measures as compensation to communities impacted by the slave trade, such as affirmative action and targeted financial assistance. Additionally, Michelle Bachelet, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, emphasized the significance of comprehensive reparations that cover satisfaction, restitution, rehabilitation, and assurances against repeat. Beyond simple symbolism, she underlined, meaningful reparations should include political, human, and financial capital, in addition to memorialization, public acknowledgement and apologies, and institutional and educational improvements. President Ramaphosa's move is a noteworthy step towards redressing historical injustices and is indicative of a growing global discourse over abolition of slavery. European colonization of South Africa began in the 17th century when the Dutch East India Company founded the Cape Colony, mostly as a port of call for ships traveling to Asia. The Dutch imported slaves to work in the Cape Colony from a variety of places, including Indonesia, India, Madagascar, and East Africa, even though the original intent did not revolve around slavery. The Cape Colony officially adopted slavery in the middle of the 17th century, ushering in a system that subjected enslaved people to deplorable living circumstances, forced work, and limitations on their liberties. It's significant to remember that most of the people who were held as slaves in the Cape Colony were not native Africans, but rather were from other regions of the world. When the British Empire took over the Cape Colony at the beginning of the 19th century, the system of slavery underwent a dramatic transformation. The British progressively enacted laws intended to abolish slavery, which finally resulted in the liberation of slaves in the Cape Colony in 1834. The complete abolition of slavery across the British Empire came next in 1838. The transatlantic slave trade saw a different role for South Africa than it did for other key trading nations such as Portugal, Spain, England, France, and the Netherlands. Compared to these big participants, South Africa's involvement in the global traffic in enslaved humans was very small. Moreover, unlike many other areas involved in the transatlantic slave trade, the enslaved people sent to the Cape Colony were not primarily intended for the American plantations. Because South Africa's experience with forced labor and slavery differs from that of African Americans in the United States, there is a less clear historical link between South Africa and American slavery. Nonetheless, colonialism, racial prejudice, and the long-lasting effects of slavery on the separate cultures are prevalent themes in both histories. Frederick Douglass was one of the leading characters in this struggle from the beginning. Douglass, who was born into slavery, managed to free himself and rise to prominence in the abolitionist cause. His poetic writings and stirring lectures effectively conveyed the evils of slavery as well as the humanity of the oppressed. Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, his autobiography, was a moving story of his life as a slave and had a significant impact on raising awareness of the reality of slavery among the general public. Another well-known character in the fight against slavery is Harriet Tubman. Well known for her bravery and ingenuity, Tubman managed to release herself from slavery and then frequently put her life in danger to help others use the Underground Railroad to reach freedom. She became known as Moses among her people because to her bravery and dedication to emancipation, which turned her into a symbol of resistance. Born into slavery in New York, Sojourner Truth rose to prominence as a women's rights and abolitionist. In her well-known 1851 speech, "Ain't I a Woman?" she questioned accepted ideas of gender and racial inferiority and brought attention to the problems faced by African American women. Booker T. Washington was another influential figure who promoted African Americans' economic independence and educational opportunities. He established the historically black Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, which developed into a hub for African Americans seeking higher education and career training. Washington adopted a more conciliatory stance than did W.E.B. Du Bois, a founding member of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP. In addition to advocating for complete civil rights and greater African American political representation, he played a significant role in the Niagara Movement, which rejected Washington's Atlanta Compromise. Journalist and activist Ida B. Wells spearheaded a campaign against lynching in the South. Wells exposed the atrocities of lynching and its application as a tactic of racial terror through her investigative journalism. Her work raised awareness of the problem on a national level and set the stage for subsequent civil rights advocacy. In addition to being a moral sin, slavery in the United States was an important economic institution that greatly increased the country's wealth, especially in the South. African Americans were denied the benefits of their labor while the labor of enslaved Africans was exploited for financial gain, generating wealth for slave owners throughout several generations. Due to policies and practices that upheld discrimination and segregation, African Americans continued to suffer structural obstacles to their growth in the economy and society even after slavery was abolished. The reparations argument for African Americans is based on this history of economic exploitation and prejudice. Racial differences in wealth, employment, education, and health are still present today, and these differences are clearly the result of this past. Compared to their white counterparts, African Americans typically have lower household incomes, greater unemployment rates, less access to high-quality healthcare and education, and lower home ownership rates. These differences are related to structural elements with their roots in a history of racial discrimination, rather than being just the product of individual decisions or situations. Recognizing this past and present injustice and addressing its effects are key components of reparations for African Americans. This could involve monetary settlements, grants for housing and education, affirmative action policies, and community investments. The goal of these reparations is to repair the social and economic inequalities brought about by centuries of racial injustice, albeit the precise nature and extent of these payments are up for discussion. There is a different historical foundation for the idea of reparations for white Americans. While there has been discrimination and hardship experienced by some white American communities, it is not the same as the institutional, state-sanctioned institution of slavery and its consequences. Redressing the legacy of slavery and institutional racism is the special focus of the reparations discussion for African Americans, which has no parallel in the history of white Americans. A larger discussion on racial justice and reconciliation includes reparations for African Americans. It includes acknowledging and making amends for past injustices, in addition to monetary recompense. The discourse persistently transforms, mirroring shifts in cultural perspectives and comprehension of racial past and disparities. The history of systemic oppression and discrimination has been intricately linked to the African American experience, spanning from the days of slavery to the current fight for civil rights. Black Americans' lives are still impacted by the terrible history of slavery, which persisted for centuries and left a lasting mark on many facets of their lives. It becomes clear from looking at the economic gaps that slavery had a significant and wide-ranging impact. For many years, African Americans were not allowed to amass riches. They had no ownership rights and were treated like property while they were under slavery. The situation did not greatly improve after liberation. African Americans' economic freedom and movement were intended to be restricted by policies and legislation, such as Jim Crow laws and black codes. Over time, This economic marginalization has widened, creating a significant wealth disparity between African American and white families. These days, there is a clear difference in access to high-quality healthcare and education, income levels, and homeownership rates. Equally depressing are the societal effects of slavery and its aftermath. The systematic dismantling of African American family structures and social networks was another aspect of the institution of slavery, in addition to forced labor. Families were split up and sold separately, with no consideration for ties to one another. Little was done to change this during the post-slavery era, since African Americans were still subjected to prejudice and segregation, which made it difficult for them to form strong community networks. In many African American communities, problems like poverty, poor educational achievement, and restricted access to resources are still very much present, and the impacts of these social injustices are evident. Moreover, institutional racism has endured in different forms since it was first introduced during the era of slavery. Systemic impediments that African Americans face in the criminal justice system, housing, work, and education are common. Particularly concerning has been the criminal justice system, where African Americans are disproportionately represented in prison populations and are more likely to receive punitive sentences. This systemic bias also exists in other domains such as housing, where African American homeownership has historically been hindered by redlining and discriminatory lending practices, and education, where schools in neighborhoods primarily populated by African Americans frequently lack the resources and support found in districts primarily populated by white people. The persistent effects of slavery gave rise to the civil rights movement in the middle of the 20th century. Leaders such as Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. came to represent a movement aimed at reversing generations of injustice. Numerous other peoples and their efforts resulted in important social and legal developments. Still, there is more work to be done on the road to true equity and equality. Talks about affirmative action and reparations are becoming more popular these days, which is indicative of a growing realization of the need to correct these historical injustices. The difficult and divisive subject of reparations involves figuring out how to make up for the decades of discrimination and unpaid work that African Americans experienced. Affirmative action laws, on the other hand, recognize that prejudice from the past still has an impact today and work to level the playing field in both education and employment. The legacy of slavery is a dynamic, ever-evolving part of modern-day America, not merely a historical chapter. African Americans' lives, prospects, and experiences are still shaped by this story. Racial tensions that persist, differences in health outcomes, and discussions about policies aimed at resolving systemic inequity are all reflections of this past. African Americans' health inequalities serve as just another stark reminder of this history. Chronic conditions like diabetes, heart disease, and hypertension are more common in African Americans. Social variables such as poverty, restricted access to wholesome food, and residing in places with substandard environmental conditions have a substantial impact on many health issues in addition to their biological component. These elements are connected to the background of economic hardship and racial segregation historically. The accomplishment gap that exists between African American and white pupils in the field of education is a direct result of this heritage. African American pupils are more likely to attend underfunded, resource-poor schools, which lowers their academic performance and reduces their access to higher education. This gap in schooling restricts professional choices and feeds the poverty cycle. In America, the fight for racial equality has been protracted and difficult. A turning point in this fight was the civil rights movement of the 1960s, which brought about important social and legal reforms. But attaining actual equality will take constant work. It entails combating racism in all of its subtle, systemic manifestations that are embedded in different institutions, in addition to its obvious manifestations. The Black Lives Matter movement has focused new attention on racial inequality and police violence in recent years. This movement has ignited a national and international dialogue about race, policing, and justice. It was developed out of a string of terrible occurrences involving African Americans dying at the hands of police officers. It has also emphasized the necessity of thorough reforms in the criminal justice and law enforcement sectors. It is not enough to just acknowledge historical wrongs when having a discussion about the legacy of slavery and its continuing influence. It's about realizing how those wrongs contributed to the injustices that exist now and acting decisively to correct them. In this conversation, historical narratives will be re-examined, enduring social and institutional structures will be questioned, and a commitment to the task of creating a more fair society will be made. A historical fact that highlights the intricate and frequently conflicting nature of American history is the involvement of certain former presidents of the United States in slavery. A number of American presidents either had slaves themselves or had some other connection to slavery. Here, we'll take a quick look at the roles that a few former U.S. presidents had in the slave trade. George Washington, the country's first president, kept slaves all of his life. Upon his demise in 1799, he was the owner of over 100 slaves. According to Washington's will, his slaves would be released if his wife Martha passed away. The third president of the United States and writer of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson, possessed slaves as well. His association with Sally Hemings, an enslaved woman who is thought to have had children with him, is arguably what made him most famous. His life in this particular area has drawn a great deal of historical examination. James Madison, the nation's fourth president, and a crucial contributor to the U.S. Constitution, which also held slaves. His father had left him slaves, which he eventually acquired during his lifetime. The seventh president of the United States, Andrew Jackson, owned slaves and encouraged pro-slavery legislation while in office. Known as the Trail of Tears, this forced relocation of Native American tribes from their native lands occurred during his administration. 10th President of the United States, John Tyler, was a well-known supporter of slavery and states' rights. The urge to spread slavery into other lands led him to advocate the annexation of Texas and to hold people in slavery. The 12th President of the United States, Zachary Taylor, was a major slave owner with a large number of enslaved people on his Louisiana plantation. Afterwards, during the Mexican-American War, he rose to prominence as a military commander. If you're eager to explore more captivating videos on history, culture, and civilization, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Like and share our content for even more intriguing videos. Stay tuned for our next video.